48 hours. That's what the doctors gave her before her organs would shut down completely. Seung-min Park stood frozen in the doorway of room 304, his tattooed hands gripping the frame hard enough to crack it. Inside, his mother, the woman who raised him alone, who worked 3 jobs to keep him fed, who never once asked for anything back, lay dying beneath a tangle of wires and tubes. Stage 4 organ failure. Untreatable. Korea's top specialists had already walked away. Her breathing came in short, painful gasps. Her skin looked like paper against the white sheets. The monitors beeped their slow countdown to the end. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the black nurse standing at his mother's bedside, holding a wooden bowl filled with dark liquid that looked like mud and smelled like earth and something ancient. Maria Aldaco's hands didn't shake, but her eyes showed the kind of fear that comes from offering the impossible. "I can save her," she said quietly, "but you'll have to trust me." Seung-min's voice came out like gravel. "What is that?" "My grandmother's medicine. It saved people doctors gave up on." "Before I tell you what happens next, and trust me, what happens in the next 48 hours will change everything you think you know about healing. I need to ask you something. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, if you believe in honoring the wisdom our grandmothers carried, hit that subscribe button right now. Because Maria's story, her grandmother's legacy, the choice Seung-min is about to make, none of it matters if it dies in this room with just you and me. Subscribe so this reaches someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's build something here. The call came at 3:47 a.m., the hour when Seoul's streets finally exhale after holding their breath all day. Seung-min was reviewing shipping manifests in his study, legitimate pharmaceuticals mixed with 40 kilograms of fentanyl precursors destined for Los Angeles, when his personal phone lit up. Not the burner he cycled weekly, not the encrypted device for business. The phone only 5 people had the number to. His hand knew before his mind did, trembling as he brought it to his ear. "Your mother collapsed," his aunt's voice fractured through the line. "They're taking her to Seoul National University Hospital. Come now." The manifests scattered across mahogany as he stood, pages of careful deception floating to the carpet like dying leaves. Within 4 minutes, his convoy of black SUVs carved through pre-dawn traffic with the urgency of a state funeral. Seung-min sat in the back of the lead vehicle, watching Seoul blur past, the city he'd conquered block by bloody block, district by district, until his organization's reach extended from Busan to the DMZ. A kingdom built on powder and pills, and the carefully cultivated fear of what happened to those who said no. None of it mattered now. The hospital's VIP wing smelled of antiseptic and desperation, that peculiar scent of places where money fought, losing battles against mortality. By the time he arrived, Korea's top immunologists had already assembled, summoned in the middle of the night, because when Choi Seung-min's mother needed doctors, you came. They stood in a nervous cluster outside the ICU, their faces carrying the universal expression of physicians about to deliver unbearable news to a man who could make them disappear. Dr. Kang, the chief immunologist, spoke with the careful diction of someone defusing a bomb. "Mr. Choi, your mother has developed a rare autoimmune disorder. Her immune system is attacking multiple organs simultaneously. We've tried every cutting-edge treatment protocol, every experimental drug in our arsenal. Then try harder." Seung-min's voice was flat, dangerous. "There are other treatments, other countries, other options. Sir, We've already consulted with specialists in the United States, Switzerland, Germany. This particular variant, it's..." Dr. Kang's throat worked. "We're keeping her comfortable." Comfortable. The word civilized people used when they'd given up. Seung-min pushed past them into the ICU. The woman in the bed looked like a cruel parody of Hana, his mother, the woman who'd raised him alone after his father vanished into the chaos of bad debts and worse choices, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep him fed, who'd never asked where his money came from, even as their apartment transformed from shabby to palatial. Her skin had turned the color of old paper. Machines breathed for her, beeped for her, lived for her in ways her own body no longer could. He pulled a chair to her bedside and took her hand, careful of the IV lines spiderwebbing her skin. It felt like holding origami, something that might crumble at the slightest pressure. The hours that followed were a masterclass in impotent rage. Seung-min made calls that would have moved mountains 48 hours ago. He offered 10 million won, then 50 million, then a blank check to any doctor who could save her. His lieutenants threatened hospital administrators with such creativity that 2 required sedation. He had his technology specialist hack medical databases worldwide, searching for similar cases, miracle recoveries, anything. He even dispatched a team to Johns Hopkins with instructions so vague and desperate they amounted to kidnapping. Bring back the best immunologist alive, willing or not. Nothing worked. Money, that universal solvent that had opened every door and silenced every objection in his criminal career, proved useless against the betrayal of failing organs. Violence, his most reliable tool, had no throat to grip one. The empire he'd built, the network of dealers and distributors, the judges in his pocket, the politicians who took his calls, the police who looked the other way. All of it crumbled into irrelevance beside this hospital bed. On the second night, Hana's eyes fluttered open. The machines had been breathing for her so long that Seung-min had forgotten the particular brown of her irises, the specific way she looked at him that made him feel simultaneously 9 years old and ancient. Her lips moved. He leaned close. "Promise me," she whispered, each word a marathon. "You'll find another way to live." The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, another family received better news. Outside, Seoul continued its relentless transformation from night to morning, indifferent to the small deaths that punctuated its streets. Seung-min held his mother's hand and could not answer, because there was no other way. This was what he was, what he'd built, what he'd become. And for the first time since he'd climbed out of poverty on a ladder made of other people's desperation, he had no idea what to say. Maria Aldeko had learned to make herself smaller in the hallways of Seoul National University Hospital. 2 years of working in a country where she stood out in every room had taught her the art of strategic invisibility. Head down, smile polite, Korean phrases carefully practiced. She'd come through an international nursing program drawn by the promise of advanced medical training and something else she couldn't quite name. A need to honor her grandmother's memory in unexpected places, far from the familiar grief of Houston. Her grandmother had died 3 months before Maria boarded the plane to Seoul. 83 years old, still mixing remedies in her kitchen until the very end, still whispering stories about women who'd healed in secret during slavery, who'd turned their oppression into survival through knowledge the slaveholders couldn't steal. "These plants remember," her grandmother used to say, grinding herbs with a mortar that had belonged to her own grandmother. They remember what our people knew before anyone tried to make us forget. Maria had packed 6 small vials before she left Houston. Her mother had protested. "What are you going to do with those in Korea?" But Maria couldn't leave them behind. They sat now in the back of her locker in the nurse's station, wrapped in a cloth her grandmother had embroidered, a talisman of home she touched sometimes during difficult shifts. The isolation had been harder than she'd expected. Not the language barrier, though that was real enough. Not even the 12-hour shifts, or the hierarchical culture that sometimes felt suffocating. It was the persistent othering, the microaggressions that accumulated like paper cuts, patients requesting different nurses, colleagues touching her hair without asking, the perpetual questions about where she was really from. Being one of the few black women in Korean healthcare meant carrying a weight that never fully lifted. She'd learned to navigate it, learned which battles to fight and which to absorb in silence, learned to find small joys in the work itself, in the patients who looked past skin color to see competence, in the rare colleagues who treated her as simply another professional trying to do good in the world. But today, something shifted. Maria had been restocking supplies in the hallway outside the pediatric ICU when she'd overheard the specialists discussing Hannah's case. The words had stopped her mid-step. Chronic inflammation, unresponsive to conventional treatment, cellular degradation with no clear etiology. And then, almost as an aside from the American neurologist, symptoms reminiscent of historical accounts of nerve damage from environmental toxins. Maria's hands had gone still on the supply cart. She knew those symptoms. Her grandmother had treated them. It had been years ago, when Maria was still in nursing school. A patient in her grandmother's community network, a woman who'd lived near an old industrial site, had presented with similar patterns. The doctors had offered steroids and experimental drugs, nothing that addressed the root cause. Maria's grandmother had prepared something different, a complex remedy built on generations of knowledge, herbs that drew toxins from tissue, compounds that supported cellular repair at a level Western medicine was only beginning to understand. The woman had recovered. Not overnight, not miraculously, but steadily, surely, in ways the doctors couldn't explain. Maria had helped prepare that remedy. She'd ground the herbs, measured the proportions, learned the theory behind the practice. And now, standing in this hallway in Seoul with Hannah dying 2 floors above, she realized she'd brought some of those same components halfway around the world. The impossible choice crystallized with devastating clarity. Speaking up could cost her everything: her career, her visa, her carefully constructed place in this foreign country. The Korean medical establishment wouldn't welcome folk remedies from a black American nurse. She'd be dismissed, probably investigated, possibly deported. Everything she'd worked for would dissolve. But her grandmother's voice filled her head, as clear as if the old woman stood beside her. Healing is not a privilege. It's a duty. Maria thought of Hannah. Brilliant, defiant Hannah, who reminded her so much of herself at that age, fighting to prove her worth in a world that would rather she stayed invisible. She thought of Mrs. Kim's desperate hope, of the clock ticking down on a child's life, while specialists consulted textbooks that had never learned from women like her grandmother. She thought of the remedies in her locker, prepared by her grandmother's hands before the cancer took her. The last gifts of a woman who'd spent her life healing in the margins, who'd carried knowledge forward from ancestors, who'd had nothing but plants and determination, and each other. Maria's hands were trembling when she knocked on the door of Dr. Park Seung-min's office, but her voice was steady, strengthened by generations of women who'd spoken truth, when silence would have been safer. "Dr. Park," she said, "I need to tell you about my grandmother." The hospital corridor exploded into chaos within minutes of Maria's offer. Dr. Kim's face flushed crimson as he stepped between her and the bed, his voice rising to a pitch that carried down the hallway. "This is dangerous pseudoscience. I don't care what desperation looks like. I will not stand by while some herbalist experiments on a dying woman in my ICU." His hand was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling hospital administration and immigration services. Whatever visa brought you here, I promise you it won't keep you here after this stunt." Maria stood her ground, though her jaw tightened. She'd heard variations of this speech before, in different languages, from men who wore their credentials like armor. But before she could respond, the room's temperature shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the climate control. Seung-min's men materialized from the shadows where they'd been stationed. These weren't corporate security or business associates. Maria recognized the particular stillness that came from men accustomed to solving problems with their presence alone. 3 of them formed a loose semicircle around her, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and expensive cologne. The tallest one, with a scar that disappeared into his hairline, spoke in rapid Korean. His tone needed no translation. Seung-min answered without looking away from his mother, his voice flat with exhaustion. Whatever he said, it wasn't dismissal. "Our boss wants to know if you're trying to scam him," the scarred man said, switching to accented English. "Lot of people try to take advantage when someone's desperate. Rich man with a dying mother. You think he won't notice?" "Ji-hoon," Seung-min said quietly, but the man continued. "What's your angle? Money? Citizenship? Or are you just crazy enough to believe this works?" The hospital's head of risk management arrived then, a thin woman with steel-gray hair and a tablet clutched like a shield. "Mr. Seung, I need you to understand the liability implications. If you allow unauthorized treatment, the hospital cannot. She's not authorized to practice any medicine in this country," Dr. Kim interjected. "This is beyond liability. This is criminal negligence waiting to happen." "I've documented 73 case studies," Maria said, her voice cutting through the rising noise. "Peer-reviewed, published. I can provide—" "Published where? In what journals?" Dr. Kim's laugh was sharp with contempt. "Let me guess. Some alternative medicine quarterly that accepts anything for the right fee?" Security guards appeared in the doorway. Someone had made the call. The risk manager was typing frantically on her tablet, probably composing the memo that would absolve the hospital of whatever came next. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us." The older security guard's voice was professionally gentle, the tone used for escorting confused patients back to their rooms. His hand hovered near Maria's elbow without quite touching. She didn't move. Something told her that if she left this room now, she wouldn't get back in. The moment would pass. Hana would die by increments, drowning in her own body's rebellion, and Maria would catch her morning bus back to work, wondering what single decision might have mattered. But it was the younger guard reaching for her arm that triggered Seung-min's men. Ji-hoon moved fast, intercepting the guard's hand with a grip that made the man's face go white. The room erupted, shouting in 3 languages, bodies moving, Dr. Kim backing toward the wall while stabbing at his phone screen. "Enough!" The single word from the bed cut through everything. Hana's eyes had opened. Not fully, just slits of consciousness in a landscape of pain, but open. Her head turned with agonizing slowness toward Maria. Their eyes met. Maria saw recognition there. Not of her specifically, but of something deeper. The same thing she'd seen in her grandmother's face when she'd decided to teach Maria the old ways despite her parents' objections. The look that said, "I know the cost of this choice. I'm making it anyway." Hana's chin dipped. Barely a centimeter, but unmistakably a nod. The room held its breath. Seung-min stared at his mother's face with an expression Maria couldn't read, something between anguish and wonder. His entire body was rigid with the war playing itself out behind his eyes. Trust no one. Control everything. Show no weakness. Every lesson the streets had beaten into him said to have these people removed, to sue them for good measure, to trust only in documented medicine and legal protection. But his mother's dying breath said something else entirely. Out! Seung-min's voice was barely above a whisper. Everyone out. Ji-hoon, take the men downstairs. Boss, now! His men exchanged glances but obeyed, filing out with the particular silence of people who knew better than to question that tone. The security guards followed, looking relieved. The risk manager opened her mouth, took one look at Seung-min's face, and retreated with her tablet. Only Dr. Kim remained, his face twisted with professional outrage, and something that might have been genuine concern. Mr. Seung, I am formally advising against. Document it however you want. Seung-min finally looked at him. I'm allowing this. The room went silent. Dr. Kim stared for a long moment, then turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a click that sounded like a gavel. Maria's hands trembled as she opened her bag and began laying out supplies she'd carried half a world to this moment. African roots her grandmother had harvested and dried. Korean ginseng from a market in Seoul where vendors still remembered the old preparations. Botanicals her hands knew how to combine, even in the dark. Seung-min watched her work, his face unreadable. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The choice had been made. The liquid looked like muddy water, thick and dark in the ceramic cup. Hana's hand trembled as Maria lifted it to her lips, and the moment the bitter concoction touched her tongue, her face twisted into something between disgust and despair. She gagged, her body trying to reject it, but Maria's steady hand remained firm against the cup's base. I know, Maria murmured, her voice carrying the practiced comfort of someone who'd administered difficult medicine before. Just a little more. You can do this. Hana swallowed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Whether from the taste or the effort, Seung-min couldn't tell. The earthiness of it filled the room, pungent and alive, nothing like the sterile chemical smell of the IV bags that had hung beside his mother's bed for weeks. Seung-min stood at the window, his reflection ghosting over the Seoul skyline. Behind him, monitors continued their steady beeping, showing numbers that meant nothing had changed. Not yet. Not in the first hour. Not in the second. Dr. Kim had retreated to the corner, arms crossed, face arranged in an expression of professional concern that barely masked his anticipation of failure. Waiting, Seung-min knew, for the moment he could say those 4 words. I told you so. His phone vibrated constantly in his pocket, reports filtering up from below, whispers in the organization, questions about his judgment, about whether sentiment had finally made him soft. Young-ho had texted twice, carefully worded inquiries that really asked, Are you still in control? The Chinese deal delegation had been rescheduled once already. His absence from tonight's meeting with the Busan faction would be noted, interpreted, weaponized. Weakness, in his world, was blood in the water. This is madness, Dr. Kim said, not for the first time. Every hour we waste. Then leave, Seung-min said, not turning from the window. Maria worked quietly, checking Hana's pulse, adjusting the compress on her forehead. Not the cold, clinical efficiency of hospital care, but something more attentive, more present. She hummed something under her breath, a melody Seung-min didn't recognize, low and rhythmic like a heartbeat. "How long?" he asked, finally turning. "The body has its own rhythms," Maria said, wringing out a cloth in a basin of water that smelled of mint, and something else he couldn't name. "Western medicine tries to override them, force results. My grandmother's way works with the body, not against it. But that means we have to be patient." "I don't have time for patience." "Then you'll fail." Her directness surprised him. "Healing isn't something you can threaten or negotiate into submission, Mr. Park. It happens when it happens." Dr. Kim snorted from his corner, but Maria ignored him. She sat in the chair beside Hana's bed, her dark hands gentle against his mother's pale skin, and began to speak. "My great-great-grandmother was a healer," Maria said softly, as if telling a bedtime story. "Born enslaved in Louisiana, denied everything, education, freedom, even basic medical care when she needed it. But she kept people alive anyway, learned the plants, learned what grew in the shadows of the plantation, what could be gathered at night. Knowledge passed through whispered lessons, midnight gatherings where the overseers couldn't see. Plants became resistance. Plants became salvation." Seung-min listened despite himself, drawn by something in her voice. Not pride exactly, but a quiet certainty that reminded him uncomfortably of his mother. When cholera came through, when yellow fever struck, when babies came too early or women bled too long after childbirth, the white doctors, they had their theories and their medicines, but they didn't have answers. My great-great-grandmother did. She kept her community alive with nothing but knowledge and courage, because that's what healers do. They don't ask who deserves healing. They just heal. "Romantic," Dr. Kim muttered. Maria's eyes flashed. "My grandmother's clinic in New Orleans sees patients the hospital system abandons. Poor people, undocumented people, people with no insurance or hope. She charges nothing. She saves lives. You call that romantic?" Seung-min felt something shift in his chest, an uncomfortable recognition. He'd built his empire on dominance, on the principle that strength meant the power to take, to control, to make others bend. But Maria spoke of a different kind of strength, one that came from giving, from knowing, from standing firm when everyone else had given up. Outside, the sun set over Seoul, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. His phone buzzed again. Another meeting missed, another question about his commitment, his focus, his strength. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why are you risking everything for this?" "For her?" Maria looked up from Hana's bedside, and in the fading light her face held a gentleness that made his throat tight. "Because your mother deserves to live," she said simply. "Because my grandmother would expect nothing less. Because healing isn't about who deserves it. It's about what's right." In the bed, Hana stirred slightly, a small movement that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. Seung-min held his breath and waited for the dawn. The monitor's rhythmic beeping had become white noise, background static to Seung-min's exhaustion. He'd memorized every fluctuation, every minor dip and spike in the numbers that supposedly measured his mother's life. So when Dr. Kim entered the room at hour 36, moving faster than usual, Seung-min felt his entire body tense. "Her breathing," Dr. Kim said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the monitors. "It's changed." Maria stepped back from Hana's bedside, her hand still resting gently on the old woman's arm. Seung-min crossed the room in 3 strides, his eyes fixed on his mother's chest. The rise and fall was deeper now, subtle, but unmistakable. Not the shallow, desperate gasps that had characterized the past day and a half. Dr. Kim pulled up the oxygen saturation readings on his tablet, his finger tracing the gradual upward trend. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Her levels are improving, not dramatically, but consistently." He looked at Maria, then at the clay pot still simmering quietly in the corner, then back at his tablet as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made medical sense. "I'm ordering a full panel. Blood work, organ function markers, everything." Seung-min didn't move. He couldn't. He stood frozen, watching his mother's chest continue its steady rhythm, afraid that if he blinked or breathed or shifted his weight, this fragile moment would shatter like glass. The next 12 hours passed in a strange, suspended state. The medical staff moved in and out with increasing frequency, drawing blood, checking vitals, whispering among themselves. Seung-min heard fragments of their conversations. Stabilizing, unexpected improvement, need to verify. Maria continued her routine as if nothing extraordinary was happening, brewing fresh batches of tea, adjusting the compress on Hana's forehead, humming those same soft melodies. At hour 48, Seung-min had stepped out to take a call from Jin-woo, another crisis that needed his attention, another fire that required his particular brand of cold efficiency. When he returned to the room 5 minutes later, his mother's eyes were open. He stopped in the doorway, his phone still clutched in his hand. Hana's gaze was clouded with fatigue, but it was there, present, aware, alive. Maria sat beside the bed, holding her hand, speaking in low, reassuring tones. Dr. Kim stood at the monitors, his expression caught somewhere between professional skepticism and genuine wonder. "The organ failure markers," he said quietly, showing Seung-min the latest results. "They're stabilizing. Her kidney function is improving. Her liver enzymes are dropping. This is..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like this." Seung-min approached his mother's bedside slowly, as if she might be a mirage that would dissolve under direct observation. When her eyes found his, something inside his chest cracked. Not a breaking, but an opening, like ice splitting under spring thaw. For years, he'd built walls around anything resembling vulnerability. Hope was a liability. Faith was for fools who couldn't control their own circumstances. Yet here he stood, watching the impossible unfold in real time. "Seung-mina," Hana whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers twitched weakly against the sheets. He took her hand, surprised by how small it felt in his. How had he never noticed how delicate her bones were? "I'm here, Mother." Maria excused herself quietly, giving them space, but Seung-min found himself glancing at her as she moved toward the window. Throughout these impossible 48 hours, she'd remained constant. No fear of who he was, no calculation in her kindness. She tended to his mother with the same care whether he was in the room or not, whether his men were watching or not. There was no performance to her compassion, no angle he could identify. That evening, after Hana had drifted back into sleep, a natural sleep this time, not the near-death unconsciousness of before, Seung-min found himself sitting across from Maria, at the small table near the window. The city sprawled below them, oblivious to the quiet miracle occurring in this hospital room. "Your grandmother's philosophy," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You mentioned balance, working with nature." Maria looked up from the tea she was preparing. "Halmeoni always said that Western medicine tries to conquer the body, cut out the bad, flood it with chemicals to kill disease. Sometimes that's necessary. But traditional medicine asks what the body needs to heal itself. It's about listening instead of forcing. Seung-min stared at his hands that had forced so much, controlled so much, taken so much. "I've spent my entire life forcing things," he said quietly. "When you grow up with nothing, when people take everything from you, you learn that the only way to survive is to take control, to never let anyone have power over you again." He paused, surprised by his own words. He never spoke like this, never revealed himself. "My father left when I was 8. My mother worked 3 jobs. We were nothing, less than nothing. And now you're everything," Maria said softly, not a question. "Now I'm everything people fear." He met her eyes. "Except you don't fear me. Should I?" He considered this. "Yes," he said finally. "Most people should. But not me?" From the bed, Hana made a soft sound. Not distress, but something almost like contentment. Seung-min looked over to see his mother watching them, her eyes clearer now, a small smile playing at her lips despite her weakness. She saw what was happening here, what was beginning to shift in her son. She saw him learning, perhaps for the first time in decades, how to be human again. Hana's breathing had settled into something closer to normal, her color returning in gradual degrees like watercolor bleeding back into paper. The crisis had passed. But Maria lingered longer than necessary each time she checked vitals, her hands gentle as she adjusted the IV line, smoothed the blanket, touched Hana's forehead with the back of her fingers in a gesture that seemed more ancient ritual than medical procedure. On the 4th day of improvement, when Seung-min caught Maria staring out the window during a rare, quiet moment, he finally asked the question that had been building in him since that desperate night. "Where did you learn all this?" Maria turned from the window slowly, and something shifted in her face. A door opening that had been carefully locked. She glanced at Hana, sleeping peacefully now, then back at Seung-min. "My grandmother," she said simply. "Ruth Aldako." The name came out like a prayer, weighted with reverence and loss. "She was a root woman in Houston's 3rd Ward," Maria continued, settling into the chair beside him. "People came to her when doctors failed them, or when they couldn't afford doctors in the first place. She knew plants the way some people know scripture. Every leaf, every root, every season of harvest. She'd make poultices for infections, teas for fever, salves for pain. She delivered babies and eased the dying." Seung-min listened, recognizing something in the cadence of Maria's voice. The way people spoke of sacred things, carefully, as if the wrong words might break them. "Her mother taught her," Maria said. "And her mother before that. An unbroken chain going back through slavery, back to West Africa. Women who refused to let their knowledge die even when everything else was being stripped away. They memorized instead of writing down. They whispered instead of speaking aloud. They disguised their medicine as cooking, as cleaning, as anything that wouldn't threaten the people who owned them." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the medication cart. "But survival doesn't mean they were safe. Even after slavery, even after they were technically free, root women were always under threat. White doctors called them superstitious, dangerous, ignorant. During Jim Crow, practicing traditional healing could get you arrested. And when someone did pay attention, it was usually to steal. Take the knowledge, strip out the culture, package it for profit without ever acknowledging where it came from. Seung-min felt something tighten in his chest. He thought of his own grandmother in Seoul, the one who died before he was born, but whose photograph still sat on his parents' altar. His mother had told stories of her, how she'd known which mushrooms cured which ailments, how she'd sewn herbs into children's clothing for protection, how she'd been mocked by younger generations for clinging to old ways. "My grandmother made me promise," Maria said, her voice dropping lower. "The day before she died, she held my hand so tight I thought she'd break my fingers. She said, 'Never let them erase us. Never let them steal what's ours without acknowledgement.' She knew I wanted to be a nurse, knew I'd be working in their system. She made me swear I'd remember where I came from." The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of generations. Seung-min understood then that every time Maria had mixed those herbs, every careful proportion and whispered knowledge, she'd been keeping a promise to a dead woman who'd kept promises to dead women before her. "Korea has this too," he heard himself say. "Traditional medicine, hanbang. My mother's generation, they grew up with it. Acupuncture, herbal remedies, entire systems of understanding the body that had existed for centuries. But after colonization, after the war, after modernization..." He trailed off, the loss too large for easy words. "We were taught to see it as backwards, primitive, something to be ashamed of." Maria nodded, recognition flashing in her eyes. "They make you choose," she said, "between honoring your ancestors and being taken seriously, between traditional knowledge and professional respect, as if the two can't coexist. As if one is automatically superior." Seung-min looked at his mother, at the steady rise and fall of her chest, at the color that had returned to her face through a combination of hospital medicine and ancient wisdom. "You weren't just fighting for her," he said. "No," Maria agreed. "I was fighting for my grandmother, for her mother, for all the women whose names I don't even know but whose knowledge flows through my hands. I was fighting for the right of marginalized knowledge to exist, to be acknowledged, to save lives without needing permission from systems that have spent centuries trying to destroy it." She stood then, checking Hana's vitals one more time with practiced efficiency. But Seung-min noticed how her touch lingered, how her lips moved in what might have been prayer, or might have been something older than prayer. He understood now that this battle was bigger than one hospital room, bigger than his mother's recovery, bigger even than the invisible war between Dr. Harrison and the knowledge Maria carried in her blood. This was about who got to decide what counted as healing, whose ancestors deserved recognition, which traditions earned respect, and which were dismissed as folklore. And watching Maria work, seeing the generations of women moving through her hands, Seung-min felt his admiration deepen into something more profound. A recognition of the weight she carried, the courage it took to practice inherited wisdom in a place designed to deny it existed. His mother was healing, but he was beginning to understand that her son was beginning to heal too, from assumptions he hadn't known he carried, from a disconnection from his own heritage that he'd accepted as the price of belonging. The news traveled through Seoul General Hospital like a virus, whispered in break rooms, discussed over cafeteria lunches, passed along during shift changes. A terminal patient, given weeks at most, walking the corridors with color in her cheeks. The nurses called it a miracle. The doctors called it spontaneous remission, though their charts couldn't explain the mechanism. The gossip reached beyond the hospital walls, carried home by staff members, shared in medical forums, mentioned in pharmaceutical industry networks where information was currency. At Daehan Pharmaceuticals headquarters in Gangnam, a towering glass monument to corporate ambition, the rumor landed on the desk of Dr. Park Ji-hoon, head of their Natural Products Research Division. He'd built his career on exactly these kinds of whispers, folk remedies that occasionally contained something real, something that could be isolated, synthesized, and transformed into profit. The company's most successful drug, marketed globally for diabetes management, had started as a tip about a tea Korean grandmother's brewed from tree bark. Dr. Park made 2 calls. The first was to a medical resident at Seoul General who owed him a favor. The second was to a private investigator whose discretion was matched only by his thoroughness. Within 48 hours, he had Hana's complete medical file, technically illegal, but easily accomplished, and a dossier on every person who'd been in her room during the critical period. One name appeared with suspicious frequency: Maria Santos, RN. The background check revealed everything Dr. Park needed to know. Filipino national, daughter and granddaughter of traditional healers, careful about maintaining low profiles. The investigator's surveillance photos showed her carrying a worn leather bag into the hospital, the same bag she'd been seen with at a traditional medicine shop in Itaewon. The shop owner, when questioned under the guise of a cultural research project, mentioned a young woman who asked very specific questions about rare herbs. Dr. Park presented his findings to the executive board on a Tuesday morning. The projections he showed made several board members lean forward in their chairs. If this remedy could be replicated, if it could treat even a fraction of terminal cases, they were looking at a drug that would make their diabetes medication look like aspirin. Patents could be filed. Clinical trials expedited through their government connections. Global markets opened. The numbers climbed into the billions. Find out exactly what she used, the CEO said, and secure it, exclusively. They sent Dr. Park himself for the initial approach, calculating that a scientist would seem less threatening than corporate attorneys. He found Maria leaving her apartment on a Thursday evening, intercepting her with a practiced smile and a business card embossed with gold lettering. Ms. Santos, I'm Dr. Park from Daihan Pharmaceuticals. I'd like to discuss a collaboration opportunity regarding your grandmother's traditional medicine knowledge. We're prepared to offer a very generous consulting arrangement. Initial payment of 50 million won, with royalties on any products developed. Maria looked at the card, then at his face. She'd seen this expression before. Her grandmother had called it the smile of the marketplace, where everything sacred could be bought. My grandmother's knowledge isn't for sale. I understand the sentimental value, but think practically. This could help millions of people. Isn't that what healers want? Healers want to heal, Dr. Park, not to feed corporate profit margins. She handed back his card. My grandmother made me promise never to commercialize what she taught me. I intend to keep that promise. His smile remained, but something shifted behind his eyes. I hope you'll reconsider. We'd hate to see such valuable knowledge wasted. The pressure began subtly. An anonymous complaint was filed with the hospital's nursing board, questioning irregularities in Maria's shift reports, irregularities that didn't exist but required weeks of investigation to disprove. Immigration officials received a tip about visa discrepancies, leading to intimidating interviews and documentation reviews. Her apartment building manager received noise complaints from neighbors who'd never actually complained, making him question whether to renew her lease. Then the subtlety ended. Maria came home late one night to find her door ajar, the lock intact, but the apartment ransacked. Her grandmother's leather bag was gone, along with the few remaining preparations she kept refrigerated. Nothing else was taken. Not her laptop, not her cash, not her jewelry. The message was surgical in its precision. She sat on her couch, hands shaking, and finally called the one person she thought might understand this particular darkness. Seung-min arrived within the hour. He surveyed the apartment with the practiced eye of someone who'd ordered similar operations himself. Daehan, he said flatly. It wasn't a question. They want my grandmother's formulas. I said no. He knew these tactics intimately, the escalating pressure, the systematic dismantling of someone's life until cooperation seemed like the only escape. He'd refined them himself over years of acquiring properties and silencing competitors. The pharmaceutical industry simply wore better suits while doing the same work. But standing in Maria's violated home, seeing the fear she was trying to hide, Seung-min felt something unfamiliar. The weight of being on the other side. The side that needed protection rather than power. Pack a bag, he said. You're moving into one of my properties tonight. Tomorrow I'm assigning security. Seung-min, I can't. Yes, you can. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience, but his eyes held something else, a fierce protectiveness that surprised them both. They're used to people who have no resources to fight back. You have me now. For the first time in his criminal career, Seung-min would use his network not as a sword, but as a shield. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the danger. Daehan had resources and legitimacy he didn't. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd threatened someone he'd sworn to protect. And Kang Seung-min had never broken a promise that mattered. The call came at 3:47 a.m. Seung-min saw the unknown number and knew. With the cold certainty that had kept him alive in this world, that everything had changed. He answered without speaking. Mr. Kang. The voice was smooth, professional, utterly devoid of humanity. Your mother had a medical emergency. She's been transferred to a specialized facility for treatment. We thought you should know. The line went dead. By the time Seung-min reached Seoul Medical Center, dawn was breaking over the city like a wound. The night supervisor, a tired woman with kind eyes, showed him the transfer papers, all properly signed, all seemingly legitimate. Emergency cardiac episode. Private ambulance. Specialized cardiac unit at a facility in Gangnam. Except Hana's heart was fine. And there was no such facility at the address listed. Seung-min stood in his mother's empty room, his reflection ghosting across the dark window. Behind him, the supervisor was still talking, apologizing, explaining. He heard none of it. He was looking at the wilted roses on the nightstand, the book Maria had been reading to Hana, left open to a page about the medicinal properties of forgotten plants. His phone buzzed. A message from another unknown number, this one containing only a location and a time. 8 p.m. tonight. Come alone. Then a second message. Bring everything. Formula, methodology, source materials. Or we start sending pieces. Maria found him an hour later, standing exactly where the supervisor had left him. They took her, he said, his voice unnaturally calm. Daehan. They took my mother. He watched her face crumble, watched guilt and horror chase each other across her features. This is my fault. God, Seung-min, this is all my fault. If I had just... Don't. The word came out harder than he intended. He turned to face her fully. This is what they do. They find what matters and they take it. This is my world, Maria, not yours. But even as he said it, he was thinking. Not about retaliation, not about the immediate savage satisfaction of violence, though that urge sang in his blood like an old familiar song. He was thinking about his mother's face when Maria had told her about the forest, about preservation, about fighting for something bigger than profit. He was thinking about the disappointment he'd see in Hana's eyes if he handled this the old way. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Jin Woo arrived first, then others, the reliable ones, the ones who understood that loyalty meant more than muscle. Seung-min laid it out with surgical precision. Daehan's private research facility in Yongin, the one that didn't officially exist. 3-story building, minimal security, designed for secrecy, not defense. They'd be keeping Hana somewhere isolated but accessible. She was leverage, not a prisoner they intended to keep. "We go in quiet," he said, and saw the surprise flicker across Jin Woo's face. "Extraction only. Get my mother out. Minimal casualties." "And Daehan?" Jin Woo asked carefully. Seung-min's smile was cold and thin. "I have something better than violence planned for them." The hours until nightfall stretched and compressed. Maria insisted on coming. Seung-min refused. They argued in tight, desperate whispers until finally she grabbed his face between her hands. "She's my family too now," Maria said fiercely. "You're both my family, and I can't just sit here while you can and you will." But his hands came up to cover hers, gentling the words. "If this goes wrong, someone needs to make sure the formula survives. Someone needs to tell the story. That's you." At 7 p.m., Jin Woo and 4 others breached the facility's perimeter through a service entrance. At 7:23, they located Hana in a converted office on the 2nd floor, guarded by 2 nervous security contractors who surrendered the moment they saw weapons. At 7:34, Hana was in a car heading back to Seoul, shaken but unharmed, clutching the phone Jin Woo handed her so she could hear her son's voice telling her she was safe. At 7:59, Seung-min walked into the appointed meeting place, a private room at an upscale restaurant in Gangnam, and found 3 Daehan executives waiting for him. They had champagne poured. They had contracts ready. They had the satisfied expressions of men who believed they'd already won. "Mr. Kang," the senior executive began, "we're glad you could—" Seung-min placed his phone on the table between them and pressed play. Their own voices filled the room, planning the kidnapping, discussing how to apply pressure, joking about what methods might be necessary if the old woman proved too resilient. The color drained from their faces. "You have 2 choices," Seung-min said quietly. "The first is that this recording, along with evidence of your corporate espionage and attempted theft of indigenous intellectual property, goes to every media outlet in Korea. You'll be prosecuted, your company will be ruined, and you'll spend the next decade in legal hell." He leaned forward, and there was something in his eyes that made all 3 men lean back. "The second choice is that you withdraw completely. No more research into Maria's work. No more contact with anyone associated with this project. You forget we exist, and in exchange, I forget what you did tonight." "You can't," one of them started. "I already have." Seung-min stood, pocketing his phone. "You have until morning to decide. But if I were you, I'd choose quickly. I'm told media outlets are very active on Saturday mornings." He walked out into the Seoul night, his phone already ringing with Jin Woo's confirmation that Hana was safe, that Maria was crying with relief, that everything had worked. And for the first time since this had all begun, Seung-min understood what his mother had been trying to teach him. Violence was easy. It was seductive and simple, and it solved nothing. But this careful wielding of leverage, this strategic mercy, this was power of an entirely different kind. He had passed the test, but more importantly, he had passed his own. The dismantling of an empire happens slowly, then all at once. Seung-min began with the easiest cuts, The gambling operations that had always felt like necessary evils rather than core business. Then the protection rackets, the underground loans, each severed connection, another thread pulled from the tapestry of his old life. His lieutenants watched with confusion that gradually shifted to understanding. Some left. Others stayed, curious about what came next. The warehouse where he'd once stored contraband became a distribution center for medical supplies. The accountants who'd laundered money now restructured legitimate investments. He couldn't erase what he'd done. The ledger of his past would never balance. But he could stop adding to the debt. Maria worked beside him through those transformation months, her presence both anchor and compass. She knew the neighborhoods that needed help, understood which community leaders could be trusted, identified the gaps where a healing center might actually make a difference rather than become another extractive institution wearing a benevolent mask. "Not downtown," she said, when he showed her the first property options. "Too expensive for the people who'll need it most, and not so far out that nobody can reach it without a car." They found the space in a neighborhood that straddled worlds, close enough to the city center for accessibility, rooted enough in community that it wouldn't feel like an invasion. The building had been a grocery store once, then a church, then empty for 3 years. Perfect bones, good light, room to grow. The Ruth Aldaco Healing Center took shape over 6 months. Maria insisted on designing the space herself, treatment rooms that felt like home rather than institutions, a garden for medicinal plants, a consultation area where traditional healers and licensed physicians could work side by side without hierarchy, each respecting the other's knowledge. She interviewed every potential staff member personally, looking for competence, but also for humility, for people who understood that healing often had less to do with curing and more to do with witnessing. Seung-min handled everything else: permits and insurance, security systems that protected without intimidating, financial structures that ensured sustainability. He used every contact he'd cultivated over 20 years, but this time he asked for legitimate favors: construction crews who worked fairly, suppliers who provided quality at cost, lawyers who navigated regulations without exploiting loopholes. Some people helped because they owed him. Others helped because they recognized something rare: genuine transformation. Hana became the center's first volunteer. She started slowly, just a few hours a week organizing supplies. But Maria recognized what Seung-min's sister needed most: not to be protected, but to be useful. Within 2 months, Hana was coordinating the entire volunteer program, her natural organizational skills finding purpose beyond mere survival. "She's good at this," Maria told him one evening, watching Hana explain the filing system to a new intern with patient precision. "She understands what it means to need help and to be afraid of asking for it." The opening ceremony happened on a clear October morning. 200 people crowded the sidewalk, neighbors curious about what this new place would actually do, community leaders cautiously optimistic, former patients of Ruth's, who'd heard Maria had returned. Seung-min stood at the back, uncomfortable with attention, but unwilling to hide. Maria spoke briefly, her words carrying the weight of everything unspoken. She talked about her grandmother's hands, about the knowledge passed through generations, about healing that honored both tradition and progress. She didn't mention Seung-min by name, but when she thanked those who helped make this possible, her eyes found his across the crowd. Before the ribbon cutting, Maria placed a photograph at the entrance: Ruth Aldaco, young and fierce and full of the certainty that healing was both art and responsibility. The frame was simple wood, the photo slightly faded, but it transformed the doorway into something sacred. Seung-min approached slowly. People parted without realizing they were doing it. Old habits of deference dying hard. He stopped before the photograph. This woman he'd never met, but who'd changed the trajectory of his life simply by being loved and remembered. He bowed. Deep and formal, the kind of bow that acknowledged debt and respect in equal measure. When he straightened, Maria was beside him. She took his hand, not hiding the scars on his knuckles, not pretending they were anything other than what they were. "She would have liked you," Maria said quietly. "Eventually." He smiled at that, the qualifier that made the statement honest rather than comfortable. Eventually is all anyone gets. The ribbon fell away. People streamed through doors that would remain open regardless of who could pay. Seung-min watched Maria move through the crowd, already slipping into the work she was meant for, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not happiness exactly, too simple a word for something so complex, but perhaps peace, perhaps purpose. The tattoos still covered his arms, the scars still marked his hands, but his eyes, reflected in the glass door as he finally stepped inside, carried something new, not redemption, too grand and self-congratulatory. Just the quiet understanding that power built something lasting, while control only ever managed decay. Behind them, Ruth Aldaco's photograph stood witness to futures she'd never see but had helped create anyway. Her wisdom finally honored rather than exploited. Her granddaughter finally home. Seung-min stands in the doorway of what used to be his warehouse, watching Maria teach a group of young nurses about the properties of ginger root and wild cherry bark. Her hands move with the same confidence his once held weapons, but the power she wields now builds rather than destroys. He thinks of the man he was, the enforcer who saw only threats and territory, who understood the world through the narrow lens of control, and barely recognizes him. The transformation didn't happen in a single moment of revelation. It came slowly, painfully, through Hana's labored breathing in that clinic room, through Maria's unwavering faith in knowledge his culture had taught him to dismiss, through the humbling realization that his strength meant nothing against the mysteries his daughter's small body faced. Violence had been his language for so long that tenderness felt like a foreign tongue, but Maria taught him to speak it, one quiet lesson at a time. The healing center they've built together stands as testimony to what becomes possible when people choose trust over fear. Where his warehouse once stored contraband, shelves now hold carefully labeled herbs, some from Maria's grandmother's recipes, others from Korean traditional medicine, all catalogued with the respect they deserve. The space hums with purposeful activity, mothers learning to brew teas for their children's fevers, elderly patients receiving acupuncture alongside herbal consultations, community members discovering that healing need not choose between worlds, but can honor both. Maria has never had to hide her grandmother's wisdom again. She shares it openly now, with dignity, explaining its history and power to anyone willing to listen. The notebook that once lived in secret has been photographed, its recipes preserved and credited to Rosalie Aldaco, a name that will not be forgotten. Some patients still look skeptical when Maria explains where her knowledge comes from, but their doubt fades when the remedies work, when their pain eases, when their bodies respond to the accumulated wisdom of generations. Hana runs through the center now, her laughter echoing off walls that once knew only silence and shadows. She is 4 years old, healthy and vibrant, living proof that sometimes the impossible simply needs someone brave enough to believe. She touches the plants growing in the window boxes with casual familiarity, already learning their names in 3 languages: English, Korean, and the African-American vernacular her grandmother Maria uses when she talks about her roots. Seung-min bows slightly toward Maria across the room, a gesture that has become habit. She catches his eye and smiles, understanding what that small movement means: gratitude, respect, wonder at the life they've built from the ruins of who they used to be. They have become something neither could have imagined: partners in healing, parents to a miracle, guardians of wisdom that transcends any single culture. The future they're building honors every ancestor who carried knowledge forward through impossible circumstances, proving that love, when given room to breathe, can transform even the most hardened heart into something capable of extraordinary tenderness. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.